Good morning and welcome to this event. As you know, we're at the University of Maryland, Baltimore, and you know there's a lot of pride here in history. Our history goes back to 1807. But there's our history too. And so part of this today is to talk about another part of our history that is not well known, that we are in the process of discovering. And that's what the presentation will be here about this morning. Prior to the pandemic, around 2021, we formed a commission called the 1807 Commission. And the thing that we had in mind was to understand other parts of the history of the University of Maryland, Baltimore. So we talked to a lot of people about how we would go about this. And remember, this is really at the first year of the pandemic, so access to things was limited. But we, in fact, talked to people at Hopkins, the Maryland Center for History and Culture, a number of other groups to say, who could do this well for us? And we came across the group of History Associates, whom you will be hearing today. They started this work, but they started this work really to ask the question about names on buildings, things that have been named after individuals on this campus. But the idea was to do more than that, and that is what we will do eventually. But for the moment, we were focused on names. They started their research, and I'm sure they could tell you more detail on this, but you can also imagine that doing research during the constrained time where you can't go to archives, where you can't see individual things, et cetera, constrained their ability to get a full picture. We had also put a distinguished commission together to look at the results of these findings and to give us advice as a next step. Around the same time, I hope that's not my doing, your computer messing it up. It's okay, it's still on. Around the same time, we also founded the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. You all know Dr. Forbes Berthoud, our inaugural leader of that group, Vice President for Equity and Diversity. And as she came on, one of the responsibilities she took on was to help us manage. By manage, I mean gather this information and be able to interpret it and eventually take action on it. COVID sort of came and hasn't left yet, but History Associates was back re-engaged once access to different resources became available, and they furthered their research because the commission, when they saw the initial results, felt that there was not enough certainty as to whether they've gotten the full picture or not. So this is an ongoing process. And I want to thank Dr. Forbes Berthoud for her energy in pushing this forward, as of course we all want to do. Today has a specific purpose. It is to present to you the current state of our knowledge. It is the facts that we know. History Associates is going to present that and what they have found. We're here to make sure that you understand the findings that we have found. We're not here to take the next steps of what are we going to do. We want to get all people on this campus involved in understanding the facts first before we proceed with what will be the next steps. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Forbes Berthoud in terms of the next step. Diane?
Thank you, Dr. Jarrell, and good morning, everyone. How are you? Thanks for joining us this morning. So following on Dr. Jarrell's comments, I do want to continue our conversation and presentation with a content warning. And this presentation will be available after this talk, and also you'll have an opportunity to provide online feedback as well. For all who are listening, welcome to those online and those who are in person. The content and discussion in this presentation will necessarily engage historical events, themes, materials related to abuse, enslavement, and dehumanization that may be disturbing, even traumatizing to our audience members and to us as a community. The content may be emotionally and intellectually challenging. If at any time you need to take a break, step away, please do so, or need to pause in any way, We will do our best to make this time and space somewhere where we can engage empathetically and thoughtfully with the findings as we work collaboratively through a process of discovery and transformation. I would like to acknowledge our colleague, Oscar Cortina, who is a senior counselor with the UMB Student Counseling Center. Thank you, Oscar. And he is available for any students who are in the room, or if you would like to make a same-day appointment with Oscar or anybody from that office, but on site here, if you'd like to talk with him shortly after, he is available. So you may request a same-day appointment as a student if you'd prefer a confidential space to meet with a counselor. So I wanted to mention that first, if there are any concerns and any emotional needs. Thank you. So a little bit about the timeline to support and follow up on what Dr. Jarrell has just mentioned. In November of 2020, the university embarked on this project with Starkle Associates to begin research. The initial deliverable was just as I was arriving in July 2021 with an initial research report. As mentioned, we needed more information and we weren't able to interact with the artifacts in person because of COVID. And so in February 2023, the project was reinstated. We now have, as of last summer, a completed report and have begun to present to smaller groups, including our Diversity Advisory Council. We introduced the project to our alumni or board foundation, and we are now presenting to the entire campus and will continue to provide this presentation to others along the way. In fall to 2023, fall 23 to now, we are presenting the findings. We shared it with deans and VPs and some of the constituent groups as well. So we're here today to present the findings of phase 1. And so these are the people whose names are on buildings, whether a building is named for these individuals or their names are there as honorees, such as with the School of Nursing, for example. We began a phase 2 part of this initiative, which began in December 2023, and we hope every 6 to 9 months or so to give an update to the campus. And that part of the project is beyond the names, and it is looking at things such as academic research, medical, legislative, economic connections to enslavement and the enterprise of slavery, and the ways in which the university was involved, connected to or had ties to the devaluation, discrimination and exclusion of Black Americans and other marginalized peoples. And so this is looking at all kinds of artifacts, speeches, laws put into place, stances that the university took, admissions policies and so forth. And so that's the second phase that is in process now. And we hope by hopefully say fall or late fall to spring next year, we will present, well, how are our colleagues doing and what are we finding? Megan and colleague Jess will present these definitions, but two of the things that we look at are connections to slavery as well as connections to racist ideology. And I just mentioned some of the ones related to the economy of slavery and so forth, and racist ideology, which can be found in speeches, letters that were written, and ways in which one group was seen as inferior to another group. And if we have public evidence or public record of that, that's noted in the findings. To put some of this in context before we continue this conversation is to understand that University of Maryland, Baltimore is part of other colleagues, other leaders in this field and in this area conducting some similar work. This is not new to some universities. Some universities started this even before 2020. So to give you a quick scan of that, one of the earlier findings that we saw was in 2005 with Emory University and Brown. So we're pushing now 20 years that these institutions started this. Then there was a wave of institutions doing this throughout the 2000s. 2016, we saw an uptick in institutions interested in ways in which universities in particular were involved in the oppression of peoples of color. A model that we are going to be following on campus here, which is part of what Education Advisory Board and other universities have used, is the RBT model, reckon, build, and transform. So first, which is where we are now, investigation, understanding the university's connection, and then working to build healthy relationships, do some kind of repair, and transformation is more of a permanent action or redesign or addressing the ways in which that harmful legacy can be changed, repaired, and we can not work anymore to perpetuate racial oppression. So the process that we are in is the investigation process, Typically what follows in the building is an initial recognition of what has happened and the university's role. And I say universities plural because this is what the model we've seen across a number of institutions, and then moving to transformation and in some cases memorializing. So quick scan prior to 2020, as I said, it's not new for some institutions. Brown, Harvard, UVA, University of Virginia, William and Mary, and Princeton initiated studies and projects. Typically, this is something I want to note. Typically, lots of these universities have departments like history departments or political studies departments, ethnic studies, and so forth. So often it is, and I know for sure it was Brown. Brown had that similar model. Often it is faculty in their areas, maybe a few specialists or scholars who conduct this research. So we are really privileged that even though we don't have that, we were able to find a great resource and experts in historical associates. So prior to 2020, about 6+ universities were a part of this. And then 2020 to 24, we've seen accelerated efforts. And you may have been reading the news or not. And if not, you may have seen that Georgetown accelerated their efforts and began doing some work in this area. Hopkins instituted their Hard Histories Project. If any of you are cued in or plugged in or follow any of these universities online or are connected to these organizations, Hopkins and Harvard actually had a joint set of webinars in the last year or so, and I got connected with many of those folks and have been meeting with them to talk about their progress. College Park, University of Maryland, just had a report, phase 1 of their work this February or so. And Loyola also has right down the road or across the street, if you will, across the city has been doing that. Here's some actions by some universities. It just gives you an idea of how Villanova, Harvard, Georgetown, and others have approached this. Some of the efforts of repair have involved endowments, has involved contributions to families, has meant putting symposia together and curricula. And there are all kinds of models. Some have more focus on economics, some have more focus on curriculum and social change, as well as community building and engagement. So for us, what does this mean for us? So today we are going to hear the findings of phase 1. As I mentioned, between now and summer, we will continue to get input from the community. After we get questions from Megan and Jessica, we will open the floor for ideas or thoughts in addition to questions that you have. And then we will be continuing to explore in the fall, right, and doing phase 2 as well. So again, a reminder, this is the content warning. Oscar is available for those who would like to speak with him, students. And if you'd like to make a same-day appointment, we thank you for your attention and your engagement. And now I'm going to turn it to Megan Anderson, and her colleague Jessica will be joining us shortly.
Good morning, everyone. All right, can everyone hear me okay? I'm always perfect. All right, so I am Megan Anderson. I'm the Director of Exhibits and Interpretive Planning at History Associates, which is a little bit of a misnomer because I do a little bit of everything, including research. My colleague Jess is stuck in construction traffic, so we will carry on without her, but I couldn't be up here without the huge team of historians and archivists who supported this effort. Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Dr. Gerald, for your words. Okay, apologies. Thank you, Katie. Okay, so in terms of the agenda today, we'll show the content warning again. We'll go through the scope of our research, some of which Diane has already talked about. We'll talk about our positionality to the research we've conducted. We'll go through the timeline, as Diane has also reviewed it, names and associated buildings. So we'll go through all of the names that we researched, our research methodology. We'll provide those definitions that Diane has also given an overview to. We'll provide an executive summary, and then we'll dive into some individual findings. And finally, we'll have a chance for some Q&A. So as Diane mentioned, this content is sensitive. It is going to cover events, themes, and materials related to abuse, enslavement, and dehumanization that could be disturbing, traumatizing. As she mentioned, we have someone from the Student Counseling Center here who can provide information regarding counseling resources. If you need to step away, please do. Okay, so to dive into the research, how we approached this. The initial project called for in-depth research of individuals whose names appeared on UMB buildings. And those were provided to us at the outset of our research, and then a few more were added during the process. A lot of repositories were partly or completely closed during COVID-19, so we relied a lot on online resources and remote inquiries with archivists. Once we restarted the project in 2023, HAI followed up on all of these additional avenues of research that we knew had records collections of interest, but we weren't able to access before. This led us to the 14 individuals that we've had findings on today. We did in-person research trips, more remote inquiries for smaller collections, online research, and collaborated a lot with archival staff along the way. For phase 2, as Diane mentioned, that is really looking at UMB's historical ties to chattel slavery and systemic racism. Slavery includes, but is not limited to, direct involvement, direct involvement by UMB or its acquired schools in the intra-American slave trade, donations, endowments, loans, forms of investment into UMB from individuals or institutions that owned enslaved persons or were involved in the intra-American slave trade and use of enslaved labor on campus facilities. So that's one part of it. The other part is looking at how the university has been involved in the devaluation, discrimination, and exclusion of Black Americans and other marginalized groups. So today we're talking about phase 1, but phase 2 is sort of on the horizon. So to begin, I just wanted to acknowledge HAI History Associates is a for-profit professional consulting firm. The team of historians and archivists who work on this project are not members of the racial community that this work most impacts. And we understand that the subject matter can be difficult and sensitive. And we also acknowledge that we are not, we have the comfort of distance from the topic. We conducted our research through the lens of researchers and historians, but this is part of a larger social justice endeavor that we are honored to be a part of. Okay, so Diane went through the timeline, so I won't bog us down too much in that, but in November 2020, we began our work. We delivered an initial deliverable in July 2021. We recommenced in February 2023 and submitted our final deliverable for phase 1 in June of 2023. Okay, so now we're going to go through all of the names and associated buildings because frankly, some of these I did not know at the outset either. So this is a nice reference for everyone. So Frank Bressler is associated with the Frank C. Bressler Research Building. Donaldson Brown is associated with the Riverfront Event Center. Francis King Carey has his name on the School of Law. John Beal Davidge is associated with Davidge Hall. George Gray has a research hall at the School of Medicine. John Eager Howard has Howard Hall at the School of Medicine. And Robert Carey Long Sr. has a plaque on Davidge Hall because he was the architect and board builder. And then finally, there are a number of folks associated with the School of Nursing. So Clara Barton, Dorothea Dix, Lucille Petri-Leon, Mary Mahoney, Florence Nightingale, Louisa Parsons, and Lillian Wald. In terms of where we looked for things, it really, we looked a little bit of everywhere. We did a lot of research in Maryland proper. So with the University of Maryland, Baltimore Library, University of Maryland, College Park Archival Collection, Maryland Center for History and Culture, Maryland State Archives, et cetera, et cetera. We looked at Library of Congress, New York Public Library, Smith College, UCLA had one record collection, University of Michigan, Yale, and then a variety of online resources, which are both, some of them are databases like newspapers.com, ancestry.com, and then others have scholarly articles like JSTOR. So to begin, as we move into the research itself, all of these findings are based on publicly available documents and records. So there may be somewhere squirreled away in someone's closet, something that might contraindicate what we're presenting today. But based on what we were able to find in the public record, these folks are connected either to slavery, racist ideology, or there were no known connections. So for connections to slavery, these folks purchased, sold, manumitted, or held ownership of enslaved people. They received benefit from the institution of slavery and the labors of the people who were enslaved. For racist ideology, this is based, again, on the public record. They demonstrated a belief that whites were superior to people of color, and that is either through racist, derogatory, or paternalistic policies, practices, and language. Okay, so the executive summary, we found 4 individuals who were definitely connected to slavery, 7 who were connected to racist ideologies, and then 3 we were unable to identify connections. We're going to dive into each one of these individually, but just to give an overview, John Beal Davidge, George Gray, John Eager Howard, and Robert Carey Long Sr. were connected to slavery. Clara Barton, Donaldson Brown, Francis King Carey, Dorothea Dix, Lucille Petrie Leon, Florence Nightingale, and Lillian Wald were connected to racist ideologies. Frank Ressler, Mary Mahoney, and Louisa Parsons did not have any known connections in the public record. Okay. So we're going to go through these one by one. I'm not going to attempt to read the entire slide to you, but I will give you the sort of higher level view of it. So John Beal Davidge was a medical doctor, and he helped found the College of Medicine of Maryland. Davidge Hall is named after him. So Davidge funded his education with aid from friends, and he came into possession of some slaves from the death of a relative. He enslaved 3 people in Baltimore City, according to 1798 records. In 1810, he enslaved 5 people whose names are unknown. Baltimore City tax records indicate that he enslaved a man named Abraham, and in 1820, he enslaved 4 people in Baltimore, 2 men or boys between 14 and 25, a woman between 26 and 44, and a woman over 45. And their names were not reported. George Gray was probably the hardest to pin down because of his fairly generic name and his Scottish origins. He was a native of Scotland, and he came to the United States in the 1700s. He died in Baltimore and bequeathed $5,000 to the University of Maryland. None of his investments for the fortune that was held were tied to slavery explicitly. And as I mentioned, the George Gray Research Hall in the School of Medicine is named for him. So he worked as an agent for several Scottish mercantile firms before retiring to Baltimore. And these mercantile firms were located in Southern Maryland, and they sold and traded European manufactured goods for cash and tobacco. While some tobacco farms were family run, many larger operations used the unpaid forced labor of enslaved people. So there's a really high chance that anything that he was doing was profiting from the slave trade. His explicit connections to slavery include, as I mentioned, purchasing tobacco from planters who were documented enslavers. He was attorney in fact for one of the mercantile firms, Jameson, Johnston and Company, and he purchased in that role 2 enslaved boys from a Charles County tavern keeper. Their names were Ralph and John. Gray also enslaved himself 1 tithable person in Prince William County, Virginia in 1785. Again, in his role as sort of the mercantile firm, George Gray purchased a 13-year-old boy named James from a known enslaver, and it was recorded at the request of Robert Ferguson. In 1791, George Gray was used to transfer money in the sale of 3 enslaved people from one estate to John Robertson, and the 3 people were Lucy, Tom, and George, and the 2 boys were likely Lucy's children. Okay, so John Eager Howard probably has the most documented, and this is for a number of reasons. I mean, he was a significant member of the community, and you know, as former governor, his records are really well kept. And so we found a lot more detail about his practices and the people themselves. So he served as Maryland's governor for 3 years. In addition to significant military and political pursuits, he tried to be vice president, not succeed. He sold the land for the medical school to the regents for $9,000, giving them a $1,000 discount as his contribution to the school. Before we get into the specifics of John Eager Howard's individual ties to slavery, we wanted to go over what involuntary indenture looked like. So in 1715, Maryland law outlawed interracial marriage and sentenced mixed race children to a period of indenture until they were 31 years old. So even though the child's legally free, their indenture was involuntary and their time of service could be sold or bequeathed. So both parents were also subjected to forced service as punishment, but that usually was not enforced. So to be clear, his estate included both enslaved and indentured people. Over the course of our research, we documented 42 men, women, and children enslaved by John Eager Howard. We also identified 14 individuals with terms of service or indenture, but without last names. So they were likely of mixed race and involuntarily indentured until they were 31. He received enslaved people from the estates of his father, mother, and brother. Howard probably enslaved additional people whose names were not uncovered in this exercise. So we wanted to give a little bit of a portrait of some of the folks that Howard enslaved. Nace was born around 1784. He was 5'7" or 5'8". He had a yellowish complexion and a scar on the first joint of his left thumb. He escaped his enslavement from Howard's Anne Arundel County farm in 1798, but he was captured. He enslaved Nace in Baltimore from 1799 to at least 1823. He was not part of the recorded estate after Howard's death, and we could not uncover additional information about him. Another enslaved woman was Jenny, who was born around 1791. Howard purchased Jenny's indenture and recorded that she was to be set free on October 18th, 1818. He did not manumit her until 1824, and there was no additional information or clues as to why her indenture got extended. And then finally, in 1799, Howard enslaved 3 people and indentured 12 others, including 3 unnamed girls, 5, 3, and 6 months old, who were all to serve until they were 30. So again, this is by no means a comprehensive picture of the folks who were enslaved by him, but it does give you a sense of the variety and ages. In addition to that, he wrote letters sort of encouraging folks to recapture or offer advice on how to recapture an enslaved person. He wrote discussing purchasing an enslaved man, and then he was also vice president of the Colonization Society of Washington and later president of the Colonization Society of Baltimore. These organizations sought to transport free Black people to Africa with the goal of separating the races. And finally, as governor, he enacted 3 pieces of legislation which directly impacted enslaved people. In 1789, an enslaved person could receive up to 39 lashes for killing a wild deer outside of hunting season. For reference, a free person's penalty for the same crime was 5 pounds. Similarly, another chapter of the law, enslaved people, if they were convicted of felonies, could be sentenced to death or up to 14 years of forced labor on Baltimore's roads or basin. And then the government would actually pay enslavers for the value of the enslaved convict. Free men and male servants similarly convicted would have served a maximum of 7 years of labor. And finally, the 1790 laws are really aimed at not creating wards of the state. So it allowed manumission unless they were over 50 years of age and unable to support themselves. It repealed part of the 1692 law, which subjugated the children of Black men and white women to indentured service, but did not affect the involuntary indenture of children of white fathers and Black or mixed race mothers. He imposed a fine of 300 pounds on anyone transporting free Negro or mulatto people out of state fraudulently, and a 30-pound fine for enslavers who did neglect their older, infirm, or disabled people that they had enslaved. Okay, and our final individual connected to slavery, Robert Carey Long Sr. was a prominent builder and architect in Baltimore. He built Davidge Hall. So in 1820, he enslaved a young woman between 14 and 25 years old and a girl under 14. The 1830 census records did not record enslaved people in his household, but it did include a free Black girl under 10 who may have been involuntarily indentured. He partnered with known enslavers to construct Davidge Hall. It was not part of this scope to look into buildings that may or may not have been constructed by enslaved labor, but we know that because these two folks were involved, the building contracts may have profited from enslaved labor. Okay, so those were the first four. Now we're going to dive into the 7 who are connected to racist ideologies. Specifically, Clara Barton was a nurse, humanitarian activist, teacher, founder of the American Red Cross. Her relationship to racist ideologies is really complex. In 1861, she initially denied that slavery was the cause of the Civil War. She wrote that enslaved people were worthless in any country only as subjects fit for missionary labors and candidates for eternity. By 1863, however, she was assisting in efforts to provide education to the formerly enslaved, and her public writings included praise for the self-liberated and the USCT. Barton later testified to Congress about abuses committed by former enslavers. So, in her actions, we see sort of a transformation of her beliefs over time. Donaldson Brown invented the return on investment concept at DuPont and General Motors. We know that his grandparents were enslavers and his father served as a colonel in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. The most damning thing that we found about Brown was his sort of paternalistic attitudes towards Black people. So, we have an excerpt here where he said that they displayed marked loyalty and respect to the grandmother. These Negro boys regarded us as superiors and were respectful towards us, but with it all, we played together and went hunting and fishing. So not necessarily as overt as some others, but certainly paternalistic. Francis King Carey is now on the University of Baltimore's law school after a $30 million donation from a foundation started by his grandson. In terms of his connections to racist ideologies, he testified before Congress in 1902 that the men of Anglo-Saxon race would not submit to benefit an alien people in the import of Cuban sugar. In 1909, he opposed an initiative aimed at depriving Black Marylanders of their vote, but not for any, pureness of heart. He wrote that the Anglo-Saxon race, with an enormous majority vote, was able to protect itself from the Negro population in Baltimore. And then finally, in 1917, as an executive of the National Sugar Manufacturing Association, he had disparaging comments towards Mexicans, saying that the advantage of getting labor from old Mexico is, of course, that it is under discipline and can't run away. Francis King Carey was specifically involved with beet industry, and so a lot of his opinions come up in the Federal Children's Bureau report about children and women working in beet fields. So he had, several things to say about that. He suggested that the lack of Americanization by the laborers was responsible for them allowing children to work rather than going to school. But and by the same token, also said that it wasn't really that hard, essentially. And then he also said that there was sort of like a comparable range of suffering in other groups of children across the nation, sort of justifying hiring practices. Dorothea Dix was an activist and author who worked on behalf of the mentally ill, the incarcerated, and the poor. And her work resulted in the founding and expansion of more than 30 hospitals for the treatment of the mentally ill. In terms of her connections to racist ideologies, she supported the American Colonization Society, which should sound familiar from John Eager Howard. The Colonization Society advocated sending Black people to Africa to separate the races. She privately condemned slavery, but she refused to publicly say anything against it. And her thinking, according to David Leitner, was that the question of race in politics was an issue of power rather than right or wrong. Among her letters, she had a clipping that contains racist language towards Black people, but it's not referred to in any of her correspondence. So unclear if it was, just errantly put in the correspondence or not. She often characterized Black people as being gay, obliging, and anything but miserable. And like later, she goes on to sort of insinuate that they do not have mental illness because they're always sort of happy and contented. She used derogatory comments towards free people of color, enslaved people, and the larger Black population. And she also sort of disparaged someone who was in favor of people of color as a glorified child and has all the caprices of a weak mind. Florence Nightingale was a British nurse and reformer who came to prominence in the 1850s. She professionalized nursing for women and campaigned to improve public health and sanitary conditions in hospitals worldwide. She was a known advocate of British colonialism. In her writings, she often spoke of the inestimable blessings of Christian civilization and the importance of engrafting civilized habits on uncivilized races. And she also often used paternalistic and prejudiced language when referring to Indigenous peoples in British colonies. Lucille Petre-Leon was the founding director of the U.S. Cadet Nurse Corps, and she became the Public Health Service's first chief nurse officer. In terms of her connections to racist ideologies, we really just found these in her, like literally her own words and different writings and interviews. So she used the derogatory term wetbacks to describe immigrant workers from Mexico. And then in interviews from the 1970s, she and her interviewer use outdated terms that may be offensive or concerning by today's standards, including references to mentally retarded individuals, stereotyping Black Muslims and homosexual men, and integration. Lillian Wald was the founder of public health nursing, and she helped found the NAACP, and her name is on the School of Nursing, as all the women here are. In her writings, she indicates that, well, in her actions in founding the NAACP, that's one story, but on the other side, there was a lot of sort of typical ideology here. So she wrote of the new group of colored people in our neighborhood and the coming of the Negro colony. And she did not want to encourage Blacks to move to the East Side neighborhood because she didn't think it was suited to them, which feels like, coded language that we even see today. So there were 3 people who had no connections found based on the publicly available records. And what I will say is that for at least 2 of these women, it could be more of a historical silencing than anything else. We'll start with Frank Bressler. He taught and practiced pediatric medicine in Baltimore. He left a $1.2 million bequest to the University of Maryland School of Medicine. We found no records that Frank Fressler supported or expressed racist ideologies in any of the records that we reviewed. Mary Mahoney was the first Black nurse to graduate from nursing school in the United States in 1879. Her 40-year professional career was working to improve the status of Black nurses. She was a member of many professional organizations, and we were unable to find any records of her supporting or expressing racist ideologies, which isn't much of a surprise. But we couldn't even read some of her lecture notes and that kind of thing because they weren't saved. So we found references to great speeches that she gave at different conferences and could not locate the actual text of those lectures. Louisa Parsons was an English nurse and founder of the University of Maryland School of Nursing. No records of Louisa Parsons supporting or expressing racist ideologies. All right, so in summary, again, we found that there were 4 folks on buildings on campus that are connected to slavery, 7 who are connected to racist ideology, and then 3 who had no racist connections that we were able to discover during our research. And now I guess Diane will open for questions.
Thank you to Megan and Jess from Historical Associates. The first part of our conversation will be questions, you're coming back up,
Yeah.
for our researchers on the historical content, anything about the artifacts, speeches, anything that you've heard today that you'd like to learn more about or want the university to investigate. So Megan, back to you.
Okay. Yes.
During the indentured servitude of Howard in particular. Did you find any evidence that those individuals, any of them were his own children?
We did not. The information on Howard came from his collected papers, and they were a lot of inventory lists and tax lists. So there was very little personal information about the individuals.
Did you find any evidence to confirm that they were not, or is it an open question?
It could be an open question. It's not something that we pursued.
First of all, thank you, Dr. Forbes-Borthoud, for all of your leadership through the work that we're doing on campus. And my question is around the methodology between the choosing of the names that you conducted the research. And I'm just interested to hear how the 3 names were chosen where you didn't find any findings or anything, and kind of how you're encompassing all the names that are throughout our campus. Thank you.
Well, the names that were investigated in this phase were given to us by the university specifically to look and to investigate. There's a phase 2 that has a much broader scope of research.
I believe you said that the identifying enslaved people who were involved in constructing Davidge Hall and possibly the church was not in the scope of the work. I'm wondering if it will be in the future, and it seems like a rather important thing that we could say these people, possibly by first name or identified by the person who owned them, actually built this building.
It's part of phase 2, looking into the actual building of it. There are very few construction records from that time, but we do know that the 2 builders that worked on it are documented in the US censuses as enslaving people. We're still looking into it and trying to find out. But yes, that is part of the scope.
Will you cover paternalistic language?
Sure, yes. So when we say paternalistic, it's sort of a benevolent assumption that someone is lesser than, right? And that they are protecting in some way. So it's more of this idea that by our intercession, we are improving these people. I don't know, am I explaining it?
Yeah, it's not direct derogatory language, but it's an assumption that the speaker or author is putting themselves in a position that is superior for no other reason than their race.
All right, we have a question from the virtual audience. Yolanda Santa Rosa, go ahead and open your mic and ask your question.
Can you hold for a second? I'm gonna mute myself back because I had noise in the background.
The thing about this house is that it feels.
All right, I guess I'll read her question for her. She says, if I'm not mistaken, you said that none of the research teams are people that have been impacted. Why is that?
A great question. We, at History Associates, we know that we have a diversity gap, right? We have no people of color in our research teams. That being said, it's something that we continue to strive towards, but it is a issue that we acknowledge.
Thank you very much for the presentation. One question, did you consider looking into the naming of the School of Social Work, Dr. Lewis Kaplan? Because I know his name is on that building. And then also, what have you learned from other universities in connecting with the family, existing family now, in the whole process of reconciliation or whatever the process looks like?
Yeah, so in terms of naming, we only considered the folks that were presented to us. So I suppose that Diane can take note of that. In terms of, sort of what other universities have done, there are some programs, some school programs that have connected, and found sort of the ancestors of those folks through time. It's sort of a question of what the next steps of this research look like.
All right, we have another question from the virtual audience. Shauna Guest, go ahead and open your mic and ask your question.
Yes, hi. I don't know if I missed this, but is there a plan though to rename these buildings that you found,
So right now, I think that we're in sort of the discovery phase, and ultimately the decision on renaming or whatever reparative actions will fall to the university.
Thank you.
Hello, I was just curious about what department at the university provided the names and will be taking the action.
So before Diane joined the university, we were in contact with Jennifer Lichman, and I'm blanking on external relations. There we go. Thank you.
We don't have any other questions from the virtual audience unless somebody puts something in the chat.
Hi, yes, thank you again for the presentation. I just a suggestion that when you refer to people being manumitted at age 31 and the reference with regard to being 50 years old, if you could contextualize that by indicating what the typical life expectancy was at that time.
That's a good suggestion. We'll take a note.
Were there images of the folks who were enslaved or involuntary indentured? I don't know if people volunteer to be indentured, but were there any images that came up along with that you all came across of it, the individuals?
No, it was pre-photography for the most part, when the men in question were enslaving people. And we didn't come across any, I mean, there are generic images, but those didn't relate specifically. And it just with the indentures, there were Europeans that were voluntarily indentured, and we did come across a few of those names in John Eager Howard's household, but they were listed that he was a Dutch man and he had a last name, so that set him apart from the people of color that were indentured and enslaved.
There was a note, and I can't remember whose profile it was on, but about an enslaved person with a yellowish complexion, which leads me to wonder, is it possible that person was indigenous?
Yes, it could be. Indigenous people were also enslaved, but it was just less common. The description came from the manumission of that person, and we took earlier feedback that just listing names and ages wasn't very helpful, which is why we pulled out some examples from Howard's estate that we could put a little bit more of a story around. And without photographs at the time, manumission statements, this is the most information that we have about a lot of people who were enslaved, is it talked about their height, their coloring, and any scars that they had. And so I wanted to include that just to this is the entirety of the record that we can find for this man. But yes, indigenous people were enslaved, but there's no indication in the records of their race.
I suppose I ask only because I'm also a historian. I actually totally understand this. I just am thinking about the university's efforts at reparation. If there is any evidence of a possibility that, these people were enslaving indigenous people as well, it would be, appropriate for reparation to include those communities.
Yeah, at this point in both phases of the research, we haven't seen anything that particularly points to that, but it's something that we look for.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm from the library here, so I would just, I'm very interested about your methodologies and the collections that you had access to. Could you speak a little bit about the value and importance of universities collecting and preserving this history and maintaining it? I know that some universities have not been able to do that due to the long histories that we have, and space is limited, of course. Digitization has been very helpful, but even that, having access to the true records, to being able to be there after COVID, to look through the records. Were you preliminary also looking at manuscripts and the institutional records as well, kind of having both of those things?
Yes, and universities and libraries are incredibly valuable. The first phase of this part of the research was done online because of COVID, and it was lucky that so much has been digitized that we were able to access as much information virtually as possible. We also were in contact with librarians and archivists that were able to access the collections personally and send us images of those. Once the world opened up again, we used the Hornbeck Library at the University of Maryland in College Park. We came to the library up here. We visited Yale,
Smith College, Yale. We had one researcher go out to UCLA just because there were notes taken by someone who took one of the doctor's classes. So, it was amazing to see sort of the network that these records formed across the country, really, to help sketch out what these people's lives look like.
And so we were looking at personal letters, we looked at published documents, we looked at government records, censuses, wills, newspapers, any recorded speeches that we could find for people. The information becomes more scarce the further back you go.
All right, we have about 100 attendees in the virtual audience, so I do want to get to some of their questions. Emily Boydston, go ahead and open your mic and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this. It's been a long time coming. So my question is, can you remind us of what the timeline is for upcoming phases, as well as what we all can expect in terms of communication of information coming out of it? I'm especially interested in, say, how alumni feel about some of this information.
I'll let Diane speak to that.
I will speak to the timeline and then Megan and Jess can talk about more of the detail of phase two if you'd like to hear that. So we're in April, between April to June, we will continue to meet with constituent groups. We have an ongoing presentation and a follow-up presentation to the Board Foundation. Actually, it's on June 25th, and we are finalizing a presentation to alumni later in June or early July. And you have on the tables here, as well as you'll get a link for all of us in the university community to provide feedback on what you've heard today and recommendations for next steps. And we also want to plan meetings through the Office of Community Engagement with community members who would like to share their feedback or ask any questions. So the next 6+ months will be feedback, input, gathering thoughts and hearing from you, and then we'll move from there. Phase two is ongoing, as I mentioned before, and that started December 2023. Because this is projected to be an 18+ month project, we hope every 6 to 9 months or so to give an update. Something like this, like, okay, we're in phase two, the first part of phase two. Here's what we found. Do you have questions or recommendations or suggestions? So that is how we plan to proceed. Content of phase two, Megan and Jess can go into a little bit more detail if you'd like to hear, unless you had questions about what I just mentioned. Did you? Yes. Of course, all of these presentations and all the things we're doing here, all the emails went to the entire university. So we can work more closely with student affairs to send targeted messages. Students may be online even now. Okay, so students are online, which is great. And the link and the QR code is available to all. Absolutely. All members of the UMB community are welcome. And then we'll have the alumni presentation, community presentations and so forth. Absolutely. Great question.
I just want to remind everyone, if you have a question, please wait for the microphone because the people at home cannot hear you without that. I want to bring in Rosemary Ferreira, who has a question. Rosemary, go ahead, open your mic.
Yes, hi. Are there records of exactly how much money people who were named in the study profited from enslavement?
There aren't specific numbers of John Eager Howard had X amount of money because of enslavement. We know that he was a wealthy individual and had a lot of property. We can look at his will and the settlement of his estate, again, because those records were kept. And we can see some individual transactions when he purchased or sold the enslavement of somebody. But I wouldn't feel comfortable trying to put a specific number on the wealth that he specifically got from enslaved people.
Hi, thank you. I'm Najma Celestin Donner from the School of Social Work. And so this is a follow-up to something you all mentioned. I know you said the team is not diverse and they're not a people of color. So as you move into the next phase, can you talk about some specific and concrete things that you're doing to ensure that you're incorporating maybe a more diverse team in terms of the research, the ways that you're thinking about this project, whether it's working with external folks, consultants? I know that the team is what it is, but it seems particularly important as we move forward that those voices are being incorporated into this process. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I will say is that in terms of finding new talent for our organization, we're certainly recruiting in different arenas than we used to. We're trying to build relationships with Howard. We had an internship program last summer.
And I think we're having it fun.
Yeah, and the internship itself was with architecture students, which wasn't a perfect fit for us, but I think that it was really enriching regardless. And then in terms of consultants, we have a number of consultants that we work with at History Associates. And, you know, we have a diverse group there. That feels like a Band-Aid rather than an actual solution. So I would say that, you know, in our hiring practices in particular, we're looking to, you know, locate and hire candidates of color.
We have a question from Jim Caper, who asks, what about Hayden and Harris on the School of Dentistry?
They weren't given to us as names, so I mean, they're part of the next phase.
Okay.
Hi, good morning. Are there any living descendants that you might make connection to through genetic databases to identify any illegitimate or mixed race children?
Maybe. Again, the information that we were able to uncover about the individuals that were enslaved by the four men is very scant. Other universities have been able to pinpoint a specific group of people that were purchased or sold and then trace that group down. I honestly don't know scientifically how we would accomplish that with the historical records that we have access to.
And for Howard in particular, he probably had the best described record of the enslaved people.
Yes.
Whereas most of them were unnamed.
Yeah, many of our numbers just came from censuses, and the censuses before 1850 only recorded the head of household. Everybody else was just a tick mark. So we don't even know ages a lot of times, their age ranges and genders, but we're always on the lookout as we go through the records to try and find out as much information as we can about each of the individuals. We would have to have something to start from. So unless, again, genetics is not my area of expertise, but unless you had genetic DNA from an enslaved person that was buried on Howard's property and then could use the databases to connect it to somebody who submitted their DNA now, it would be difficult. But again, it's not outside the realm of scientific possibility, but it would be difficult with the information that we currently have.
All right. Yolanda Santa Rosa, who if you remember, was in a noisy environment, asks, what is the purpose of the research? Is it research just for the purpose of research, or is it research to correct some wrongs? What's the intent of what you've uncovered?
Yeah, I would say that our research in particular is just one step of a reparative process that Diane mentioned in her presentation. You know, sort of the first steps are, learning and acknowledging the information, and then you can take it and turn it into a tangible. So right now it just feels like historical research has been done, but I think that the intent is to, move past the research and figure out what kind of reparative action would best serve the community.
Hello, my name is Dag, and I have a question because I very know the Decatur House in DC has benefited from the physical archaeological study of the people who lived and worked there. We're standing next to Davidge, which is being renovated now. Is there any plans of actually looking at the physical structure to understand what may be there in terms of evidence of people building it who were enslaved or indentured?
That's a great question. That is not within our current scope. And we would undoubtedly need to bring in folks who are professionally trained architectural historians and the like for that. But thank you.
All right, Charles Shalee has the next question. Charles, go ahead and open your mic.
What is the university's current vetting process for accepting donations for named building and spaces? And second part, how does that compare to the process in 2011 when the law school was renamed for Francis King Carey?
We'd have to pass that off to somebody from the university.
So there is a vetting process. I can't tell you how far it goes back. I will tell you that currently, since the, I'm gonna guess at this date, but around the time when Byrd Stadium was renamed at the University of Maryland College Park, the Regents put forward a very rigorous vetting process. So there is a strong one in place now. I just can't tell you how strong it was before that particular event.
All right, Victoria Meadows has a question. Victoria, go ahead and open your mic.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for this presentation. I appreciate it, and it was very valuable. My question to you is, I do understand that you went through public records and things that you could put your hands on. However, in phase 2, is there any sort of some sort of deeper dive for individuals that had no connections found to ensure that there is indeed no connections found with those individuals?
So what I will say about phase 2 is that it's a much broader look at sort of connections to racism and slavery. And so we aren't necessarily revisiting any of these names for the phase 2 research. We are reconsulting some of the records, but not necessarily with the same intent.
Right. In this first phase, we were doing deep dives into these particular individuals. For phase 2, it's a broader look at the University of Maryland, specifically Baltimore and the professional schools here from the beginning of the medical college to present, and looking at the university's policies and actions as an institution, both in dealing with the institution of slavery and then post-Civil War in segregation and racist policies. So we're not doing specific individuals going through every paper we can find on them, but more looking at university records, public records, and a few personal things of pivotal people that were part of it.
My question is related to what you all just answered, is about private records. I heard you say several times that you looked at what was available publicly. And so I'm curious about private records like the Carey Foundation or other individuals whose families might still have things. So just curious about things like that.
We have not gotten that deep into it yet. We're still only in the first phases of this, but yes, that's something we will explore. Yes, that is something we'll explore.
Looks like we do have a question from the virtual audience. Let me see if I can get Chanel Whitaker in here. Chanel, where are you? Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, good morning. Thank you again, Dr. Forsberg-Thao, and to the historian group for the very thoughtful and careful presentation of this very, very difficult history that I think we absolutely should continue talking about because it is part of this campus's legacy. Related to that, I heard the list of the different groups that this presentation will be shared with. However, we also want to consider that although we don't have a direct connection to the Black members of the community being connected to those people who were enslaved at that time, there is a connection just from the historical perspective that many Black members of the Baltimore community have ties to slavery. So will there be an opportunity for certainly the members of West Baltimore who are our neighbors be shared with them, and maybe even the broader Baltimore community, but certainly with our neighbors right here in West Baltimore?
Yes, I have received a nod. Yes, I think that also all of this is public, so anyone could register for today's event, for example. Okay. Apologies. To further sessions will be held for the community, but yes, it will be shared.
So my question or comment kind of adds on to the question that was just asked. But as we talk about the diversification of talent of the research team who is conducting the research, just ensuring that we are diversifying the collections that we're using when the research is being conducted. And so you had mentioned Howard University. So thinking about the local and also the national HBCUs throughout the nation, and Howard specifically has a very, very extensive collection when we're talking about their library. So just encouraging outreach, especially to the leadership who runs those collections and our PhDs and very well researched as well, and could probably be providing additional findings.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have someone up front, no one in the virtual audience right now, but just give us a moment to get the microphone up there.
I know you guys said the PowerPoint will be available online. Are the research findings available? And if so, where would I be able to find them? I'm not sure if you guys are done with them or.
Presentation in a few weeks.
A big thank you to Historical Associates for their research efforts and engagement with us, Megan and to Jess. We have a few more minutes, and so there are two opportunities for us to share some feedback, and if needed, we can have another session as well. So on your tables and online, you should receive a link or the QR code if you'd like to use that, an opportunity for you to begin to look at some of the kinds of questions that are occurring to you about university action. And I would like to open the floor or online opportunity for you to share based on what you've heard about what other universities have done. If you have ideas or suggestions for the ways in which University of Maryland, Baltimore could move forward. What we do, I took some notes as we were going along, definitely heard working more to diversify the research artifacts and things like that. We had talked about things like the Afro-American newspaper and so on. So we've been working on that for phase 2. We did talk about community engagement, and so we'll work with OCE on working with, figuring out an event somehow online in person. And there are questions about the wealth gained from slavery and so forth, and finding those kinds of things out. This question about descendants is a very interesting one. So what we need to do is more research on how did Harvard and Georgetown and Villanova and some of these universities trace, if you will, the descendants, and then following up with responses there, either statements and or payments or things like that. So thoughts and questions, whether you want to put your thoughts online and we can read some of those, and or if you would like to share your ideas. No decisions are being made today. It's to hear your input and ideas for what we could possibly do. And there are many, many ways to approach this. Yes, Mike in the middle, just a moment, please. If you're online, would love to hear your thoughts, and we will save the chat and gather all input.
So much. I just have a question looking at the medical field, the human sciences field. What are we as a university, I know you can't answer this today, doing to change the trajectory of bias that still exists? It may be something that came from this slave owner, this person with this racist ideology that's now infused in content, that's infused in education. So looking beyond the building, looking beyond the money, how are we going to shift some perspectives and make sure that in the curriculum that we set at UMB, that's really like infused totality, right? From first day to graduation and even into residency and beyond.
Thank you so much. Great question. I will provide my non-medical response, but administrator response, which is I know in the School of Medicine, there's a review curriculum committee. In fact, I just did some work with them for a presentation for the American Public Health Association. And so all of those syllabi are being reviewed and discussed. Also with University of Maryland Medical System, as well as a partnership with the School of Medicine. There has been a lot of great work to eliminate race-based medicine related to VBAC, vaginal birth after C-section, GFR, which is the indicator for stages of kidney disease and treatment for dialysis and things like that. And so a number of these policies or practices or things that have been taught in medical school, as I understand it, are race-based with mythical and untrue and biased thoughts about Indigenous peoples, Black people, women, and so forth that place them at a higher risk and increase the opportunities for health inequities and health disparities. So changing those policies, teaching students about those things, the history of that. I know Dr. Joseph Wright, while he was here, made many presentations related to those kinds of things. Physicians in the room, how did I do? So those are some of the things that School of Medicine is on the forefront of changing and doing. The Masters in Public Health has a social justice track that speaks to some of these historical issues, what we call place-based pedagogy, understanding the history of redlining and a number of issues in Baltimore related to poverty, et cetera. And so that's all being shifted and changed in our curriculum too. And there's more to do, as far as I know, around drug testing and other things. Other question here.
I was just thinking, I noticed that there was a track, but just like involving structural oppression courses and generalist courses. I know as an MSW student, we had to take a course that took a couple of hours before we started our fall semester. So providing that for medical students possibly, or every student at the university, I'm not sure.
I am looking at Associate Dean Celestine Donner, who is going to, yes, going to take up that cause. So great suggestion from our colleague here, which is that structural oppression course that all social work students, if I understand, have to take, that be made available to the School of Medicine. So we love interprofessional education and collaboration. So there are possibilities there. Comment?
And I want to add to that because we were involved with the School of Social Work when they developed that course. And they developed a corollary to that course, which was a briefer course of several hours. And the senior leadership of the university, including the deans, all took that course. So I do know what you're talking about. That was three or 4 years. It was a couple of years ago that we did that. So we haven't made a decision about requiring that in all curricula, because as you know, each school is independently accredited. And so when you institute things like that, it has to fit into a certain rubric, but that certainly is on the table. Diane mentioned the curricular changes to your question in the School of Medicine, but it's certainly not limited to the School of Medicine. And I know other schools are doing things in that direction as well. The other thing that's happening across a broader front is we have a thing called appointment, promotion, and tenure in all of the schools. And so those policies are being looked at relative to how you recognize activities in this general field and reward faculty with promotion or tenure. So there's a broader effort that you're not seeing from this single report.
We do have another bit of feedback from someone in the virtual audience, if you have a moment.
Yes, please.
Let's bring in Courtney Jones Carney.
Sure.
Hi, folks. Dr. Courtney Jones Carney from the Division of Student Affairs in the Graduate School. So I'm a little curious about how UMB plans to respond to the immediate impact of this research as a Black woman who is a descendant of those who were enslaved. None of this information comes as a shock to me, but it's still heavy for me. And so I'm also very curious about what the institution plans to do for students, faculty, staff, community members who maybe express that they don't feel so comfortable in some of the spaces after hearing this information about the individuals who are named on some of the buildings.
Great question, and certainly a complicated set of dynamics. First, at all of our events like this, providing sociological, emotional, psychological support. And I would love for us to talk some more about how we can collectively respond, right? So as we think about transforming curricula, as we think about responding to people's emotional needs and that kind of thing, I always think it's important to ask people not only how they're affected, but what would be needed to support that their continued time at the university. So would love to hear from you all. We got some initial feedback from the Diversity Advisory Council as we continue to meet. I think it's important to talk about as well. Certainly there's social support, and I do think the reparative actions, which I hope we can talk about a bit today and later, will be some of the ways that repair can be done. It's not complete at all. Curricula, apologies, statues, memorializing, renaming. I mean, all kinds of options are there. That is part of the repair action as well. Question in the front?
Thank you. This may be beyond the scope, but is there any plan to look at the historical experimentation on Black bodies through the university?
Yes, that is part of phase 2. So medical connection, academic research, funding for those kinds of things. So policies and practices related to that, yes. Questions about how should we move forward? And also please use the QR code or the link. If you are online or in person, because I think I also need this, we could just engage in a little bit of breathing. Just breathe in. Out through the mouth as many times as you need to do this. This is very, very important work. We thank you for engaging with us. We thank you. We give our thanks and gratitude to Historical Associates, to Ms. Lichman's office for starting this project off for us, and my team, Team EDI, that has been working to make this happen. We are going to be talking about this for at least 24 months, I think. And so know that the university is committed. We are committed to doing what is right and taking the appropriate actions over the next few months to years. We welcome your input. You have the opportunity at the QR code there, and we will all be, at least I'll be hanging around after, and as many of us as possible to listen and to see how we can move forward. So thank you so much to the university community and to all of you, and have a great rest of the day.